welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works. You send us the stuff that's got you thinking, articles, research, maybe just a nagging question, and we jump in and explore it.
And today, well, it's a bit like a botanical detective story. One of you sent over a whole collection of material about this really enigmatic plant that seems to have just vanished, Silphium. Ancient legend stuff.
That's right. We've got archaeology reports taking us to, lost cities in Libya. We're looking at ancient art coins, mostly, and these really interesting little figurines.
And of course, the written record, those little mentions scattered through ancient texts.
Yeah, so our mission today, really, is to try and piece this puzzle together. What did Silphium actually look like? Why did it disappear? And this is the really cool part. Could it still be out there, maybe hiding under a different name?
It feels like hunting a ghost, doesn't it? A plant ghost.
Totally. And what's striking right away is just how important this plant seems to have been, especially Cyrenaica, that's modern northern Libya.
Absolutely central. Okay, so where do we start? Archaeology.
Let's dig in there, literally. The sources mention these early digs in Cyrene back in the 1910s, and they found hundreds of ceramic figurines.
Yeah, hundreds. Mostly women, and the key thing is they're often holding what looks very clearly like a Silphium plant. Just finding so many really tells you something about its cultural weight.
And it wasn't just figurines. The coins from Cyrene, they're practically covered in Silphium images, aren't they?
Covered is a good word for it. For like 300 years, starting around 560 BCE, Silphium was the main symbol on their silver coins.
Wow. 3 centuries.
Think about that. It was their brand, essentially. You see the whole plant or just the fruit, the flower, a leaf, even the seed. It shouts about its importance to their economy, their identity.
Now, I saw something about stamp bowls, initially thought to be Silphium, but that changed.
Right. That's a great example of how interpretations shift. Later analysis suggested those stamps weren't Silphium after all. The current thinking is they were probably palmette decorations. You know, that fan-like design.
Okay. On drinking cups.
Exactly. Black glaze kylikes, so not Silphium. A good reminder to always re-examine older findings.
It sounds like those early digs focused on art objects might have missed some actual plant evidence, though.
That's a really key point. Back then, the focus was very much on, well, treasure hunting almost. Statues, coins, nice pottery. There's not much record of them systematically looking for organic stuff like seeds or charred bits of plants.
So potential direct evidence could have just been discarded.
It's quite possible, yeah. And that lack of focus on the small organic bits seems to have carried on even in later digs, like at the Sanctuary of Demeter in the 70s.
Standard practice now, though, right? Sieving and flotation.
Oh, absolutely. Flotation, especially using water to separate light organic bits from soil, essential for finding fragile plant remains. But the reports from those Cyrene digs don't mention it.
Okay, but Cyrene wasn't the only game in town, was it? What about other places in Cyrenaica?
Good question. Cyrene was the big one, but other centers like Eusperides, modern Benghazi were important too, especially for trade. Excavations there have given us other perspectives.
Any Silphium hints from Eusperides?
Possibly. Some amphorae, those big transport jars found there, have stamps that might be Silphium. It's suggestive anyway.
Because amphoraes were used for shipping things like resin.
Exactly. And Silphium resin was incredibly valuable. So these stamps could mean those jars carried Silphium resin. It's a maybe.
Interesting. But Eusperides had another big industry too. Something about purple dye.
That's right, murex processing. Getting that super expensive purple dye from sea snails have to have been a primary focus for Eusperides' economy, maybe even bigger than Silphium for them.
And when they did find plant remains, they were using flotation.
They found things like barley, grape, fig, but no Silphium recorded.
Okay, so if Cyrene was the heartland and Eusperides had other priorities, what about Apollonia, the port for Cyrene? That seems the logical shipping point.
Precisely. Apollonia would have been the main hub for sending Silphium out across the Mediterranean. University of Michigan did digs there, found the usual port city stuff, walls, baths, coins, glass, pottery.
But again, no mention of plant remains. We're even looking for them.
Frustratingly, no. The reports just don't detail any botanical finds or specific methods like sieving.
But the pottery itself, could it hold clues, like residue inside?
That's a definite possibility. Silphium was traded as a gum or resin, this sticky stuff. Tiny amounts might still be trapped in the pores of those ceramic jars from Apollonia.
How would you even find that?
There's a technique called GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectrometry. It's super sensitive for identifying specific molecules. You could potentially analyze ceramic fragments and find the chemical signature of silphium resin. It's a long shot, but worth trying.
Okay, and Apollonia has this extra twist. Part of the ancient harbor is underwater now, right?
Yes. Earthquakes and subsidence over time mean parts of the old harbor are submerged. Nicholas Fleming did underwater surveys back in the late 50s, mapped out ship slipways, quays, and inner and outer harbor.
And why is that inner harbor so interesting for finding silphium?
Because it's likely got a muddy bottom, sheltered waters, lots of silt. When things sink into mud like that, the lack of oxygen and anoxic conditions preserves organic material incredibly well.
So sunken cargo, like silphium, could still be down there.
It's possible. Fleming's survey was mostly about the structures, not digging in the mud for cargo. But the potential for preservation is huge.
And we know other organic things survive underwater like that.
Oh, absolutely. Shipwrecks in the Med have yielded amazing things intact. Pomegranates, olives, almonds, grape seeds, pine pitch for sealing ships, even butchered meat. It shows what's possible.
So Apollonia is a prime target. Anywhere else we might look underwater. Other trade destinations.
Definitely. Think about the trade routes. Malta is close by. Major ports that traded with Cyrenaica, Carthage, Leptis Magna along the coast, Piraeus in Greece, which Theophrastus actually mentions as a destination for silphium.
So shipwrecks near those ports.
Exactly. Or even places known for shipwrecks, like that area around Fornoi Island in the Aegean. Any wreck that might have been carrying cargo from Cyrenaica is a potential source.
And if we found actual silphium remains underwater, what then?
The dream scenario would be getting ancient DNA. That could finally tell us its genetic secrets, who its closest living relatives are. Huge breakthrough.
Okay, fascinating potential there. Let's shift to the visuals, the art. What do the coins and figurines tell us about what silphium actually look like?
They're crucial, really, especially the coins from Cyrene. Starting around 560 BCE, they consistently show silphium. It's our best, most continuous visual record.
And the very first images were just one part.
Yeah, the fruit. Always shown in this distinctive sort of heart shape. That was the first bit they put on coins. Later, they showed the whole plant, flowers, leaves, seeds.
The sources compare early versus later coin designs. What's the difference?
The earlier ones seem a bit more naturalistic. You can kind of see details like how the stalk grows, leads opposite the flower clusters, the umbels, like parsley or fennel has.
And the later ones?
They get more stylized, the stalk looks thicker, maybe less detailed. The flower umbel sometimes looks a bit simplified, maybe not quite accurate.
So the later, maybe less accurate style became more common, and that might have skewed how we picture silphium today.
That's the argument, yeah. Because more of those later coins survived, maybe our mental image is based on that slightly simplified version. But if you look at the earlier ones...
They look more like
modern Zorula species.
Yeah.
Giant fennels, which many botanists think are probably silphium's closest relatives. So the early coins might be closer to the real thing.
Okay. And the terracotta figurines. Women holding silphium stalks. Can they tell us how big the plant was?
Maybe give us a rough idea. They found loads of these, remember? Often showing a woman, maybe the goddess Cyrene herself, holding a silphium stalk.
How big are the figurines?
The example in the source is about 14.5 centimeters tall.
Yeah.
So if the woman is roughly proportional, the stalk looks, manageable, not enormous.
It's still artistic interpretation, right?
Yeah.
Not a photograph.
Exactly. It's stylized. So trying to get an exact height from them is speculative, but it suggests it wasn't like a giant tree-sized thing.
Right. Okay, archaeology, art. Let's turn to the written word. What do the ancient authors tell us?
They give us some amazing clues, even if they're sometimes just fragments. Our sources mention a big survey by someone called Ashuti, but we can hit the highlights.
Herodotus, the historian. What's his take?
Herodotus basically uses Silphium to define the region. He says Cyrenaica, the land of Silphium, stretches from this island Plataea to the Gulf of Syrtis. It shows that deep connection the plant was the place, in a way.
And Aristophanes, the playwright, he brings some humor.
He does. In his play Birds, a character is busy grating silphium for a sauce and totally ignores the gods who show up. It's funny, but tells you two things. Silphium was valuable, you'd ignore gods for it, and grating suggests it was maybe a lumpy resin.
Like asafoetida, maybe?
Something like that, yeah. And in another play, Knights, there's a joke about a politician making silphium so cheap it gave everyone gas.
Huh. So normally expensive and known side effects.
Seems like it. Then you get Theophrastus, the botanist. Much more detail.
What does he say?
He says it grew all over Cyrenaica, but especially well in a place called Silphiofera near the Gulf of Syrtis Hilly, forested, more rain there. He describes getting the juice, the gum, by cutting the root and stem.
Root juice better than stem juice.
Apparently, yeah. Clearer, less liquid. And he says the local Libyans knew the right time to harvest. Crucially, he also talks about how they shipped it.
How? This links back to the archaeology.
Exactly. He says they put it in vessels, probably those amphorae, mixed it with meal, like ground grain, and shook it up to preserve the color and stop it decaying on the way to Piraeus and Greece.
So definitely shipped in jars, likely as a processed gum or resin. And then there's Pliny the Elder, writing later. His account sounds pretty final.
Yeah, Pliny calls it very remarkable, says it sold for the same price as silver, huge value. But then he states flatly it was gone from Cyrenaica. Extinct.
And he blames Kieves.
Sheep grazing. He says the tax collectors, the revenue farmers, preferred letting sheep graze the land over harvesting the wild Silphium. He also mentions an inferior substitute, laser, coming from Persia and other places. Maybe asafoetida again.
But Pliny writing in the 1st century CE wasn't the end of the story. Someone mentioned it later.
Right. Synesius of Cyrene, writing way later in the 5th century CE, 400 years after Pliny, Synesius mentions a shipment that failed and specifically says it included Silphium.
So maybe Pliny was wrong. Or maybe it survived in tiny pockets. It complicates the extinction date.
It really does, which brings us right to the big question. Why did it vanish? If it vanished, what caused it?
Okay, the theories. If Pliny was right about the 1st century, it's one of the earliest recorded extinctions caused by us, basically.
A sobering thought. The theories range from big environmental stuff to human actions, even the plants on biology.
Let's start with climate change. It disappeared around the time of the Roman warm period.
The timing lines up, roughly. Maybe 250 BCE to 400 CE. Strabo described the Silphium areas as arid and sandy already, so if it got warmer, more evaporation.
Could have made it too dry for Silphium.
Possibly, especially if it had very specific needs. We know plants that are sort of unique, evolutionarily speaking, and live at lower altitudes are often more vulnerable to climate shifts.
Okay, what about just using too much? Overharvesting, it was worth so much money.
That seems like a really strong possibility. It grew in a limited area, making it vulnerable. Sheep grazing, like Pliny said, could damage the plants and soil.
Theophrastus mentioned rules about harvesting, right?
Yeah, about not cutting the root too much, but if the price was skyrocketing, maybe those rules got ignored. Digging up the whole root gives you a bigger immediate profit, even if it kills the plant long term.
Makes sense. What about the soil itself? Could something have changed there?
That's an interesting one. Cyrenaica has pockets of good soil, but a lot of it is shallow, limestone-based, not super rich. Maybe Silphium needed very specific soil conditions, like certain grapes need specific terroir.
And land use changes could affect that.
Definitely. Clearing forests for olive groves or grain fields, which we know happened, causes soil erosion. It changes the soil chemistry, disturbs the microbes. Maybe the soil just stopped being right for Silphium?
Okay, now the complex one. Genetics. Polyploidy, hybrids, apomictic reproduction. What's the core idea there?
Okay, so Theophrastus thought Silphium was kind of a new discovery. Maybe it wasn't an ancient, stable species. Perhaps it was a polyploid, a plant that spontaneously doubled its chromosomes, creating new traits, like happens with some crops. Or maybe it was a specific hybrid between two wild plants.
Giving it extra potency, hybrid vigor.
Exactly, producing more of that valuable resin. But the downside of hybrids is they can be unstable. If they crossbreed with other varieties, they can lose those special traits, just revert back to looking like any other wild plant.
And this apomictic thing, reproducing without sex, essentially.
Yeah, basically cloning itself through seeds. If Silphium did that, it would explain why it was supposedly so hard to cultivate elsewhere from seed, and it would mean if you damaged the original wild population badly, that was irreplaceable.
Wow. Okay, one last theory. Nomadic raids. Strabo mentioned barbarians destroying it.
He did, yeah. Hard to prove definitively. There's an account of Romans fighting the Garamantes tribe in southern Libya around 100 BCE, maybe near Silphium areas.
But did that wipe it out?
Doesn't seem like it completely. Pliny says Rome bought 30 pounds in the 90s BCE, and Julius Caesar supposedly got 1,500 pounds in 49 BCE. So it's still around and valuable after those potential raids. Raids might have hurt supply, but probably weren't the knockout blow.
So a whole mix of Potential reasons: climate, overharvesting, soil changes, maybe its own weird genetics, maybe raids chipping away at it. But then there's this other idea. What if it didn't go extinct?
Right. The displacement theory. This is where the ghost hunt gets really interesting. What if it survived, but somewhere else? Smuggled out, maybe, or dispersed naturally?
And if it reproduced mainly by that apomictic cloning method, growing it from seed elsewhere would be tough.
Exactly. But maybe a whole plant or a part that could regrow made it somewhere else. And remember the visual similarities to ferula plants.
Found in other parts of the Mediterranean and beyond.
Yeah. Which leads to this idea of plant blindness. You know, how we humans tend to focus on animals and just not notice plants as much or undervalue them.
So a Silphium, or something very much like it, could be growing somewhere today, but we just haven't recognized it for what it is because it's not in Libya and may be used locally for something different.
It's a fascinating possibility. Maybe it's known by a local name, used in folk medicine or cooking, but nobody made the connection back to the legendary Roman plant.
So how do we find out? How does the hunt continue?
Two main paths, really. Keep looking underwater, especially off Libya, hoping for that physical evidence, that ancient DNA. And compare the genes. Do big genetic studies of living ferula species and other candidates, looking for unique genetic markers, especially any that might link back to North Africa to Libya.
So the ultimate prize could be finding that DNA signature either in an ancient sample or a living plant.
Precisely. It's incredible to think about. This plant, worth its weight in silver, maybe it's just out there, hiding in plain sight, obscured by time and maybe by our own tendency to overlook the plant world.
What a thought to end on. We've dug through the archaeology, looked at the art, read the ancient whispers, weighed the extinction theories, and maybe, just maybe, the ghost is still out there.
The hunt continues. It really makes you look at the plants around you a bit differently, doesn't it? Wondering what stories they might hold.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mystery of Silphium.